welcome you on behalf of Department of Politics and Governance. Actually, this lecture is organized by the Research Scholars Reading Club of our department.
Okay.
So, the topic today we are going to discuss is one of the challenging topics, or rather issues in Islam. Which is the problem of authenticity in contemporary interpretations of Islam.
Well, I think there's some background noise. I think if people can mute themselves, because when multiple people are talking. Oh.
Okay. Please mute your mics. Anyone who has his mic on, please mute it.
Oh, wait, there's some sort of an echo, actually. No, I apologize. I mean, I think there's an echo. Was that from my end? Oh, I know why this is happening. I apologize. I know this is my fault. This is technology. Okay, now I just worked it out. I apologize. Because we went live and there's like a 15-second delay between Zoom and YouTube. My bad. I apologize.
It's okay. So the topic, it's actually one of the reigning debates in Islam today, the problem of authenticity, because everyone has his own interpretation, his own version of Islam. With this, there comes the problem of Islamophobia. There is a debate on Islamic State, like there are internal conflicts within Muslims, the problem of sectarianism. Every sect says we are best. So with that result, there isn't any good relationship between different sects, which is ultimately resulting in the problem of authenticity. For example, like Shia say God has sent interpreters, so we don't need interpreters. Like they say God has sent 12 imams, they are the interpreters of Islam. Similarly, Sunnis say God didn't send interpreters, but he rather sent consensus of ulamas, which they call ijma. And within Sunni and Shia, there are conflicts over a number of matters. Shia government has critics within Shias, and similarly, Taliban or Boko Haram, they are discarded by some what we call moderate factions of Islam, moderates. And there is also like a group of scholars who want to create a liberal, pluralist or feminist version of Islam, which is again discarded by what we call the so-called extremists. So this is a really challenging topic. I hope we have a fruitful discussion today. Before this, I would like to request Professor Khalid to formally welcome and introduce you. Professor Khalid.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you so much. We are happy to have today with us Dr. Hasan Azad, who is a PhD from Columbia University. Dr. Azad has worked on various topics, and he has been looking at the construction of the political and media narratives on the Muslimness and the otherness. And he has been writing on a lot of topics, which includes in the contemporary topics like digital Islam and artificial intelligence. And he has been also working and running an online journal where a lot of papers are being published on which discuss around the themes around the authenticity of Islam and various discussions which are on the larger realm of Islam. Today's topic is really important, as Amir has already set the tune of the discussion today. I will add one more thing, that it might not be only the internal debates within Islam, but Islam versus the other, whether we consider it modernity, Islam versus democracy, Islam versus secularism. Those debates have also resurfaced looking at the contemporary politics in various regions that has exploded the question of identity again. So there is this debate within Islamic scholarship about ijtihad or the authenticity of the Islam, where the debate over the tradition versus modernity has come back. So we are happy to have Dr. Hasan Azad here. And let me also announce formally that we have now research scholars reading group in the department, and this is one of the first programs which they are conducting. I'm really happy that the research scholars are taking a lead in organizing these kind of webinars. With these words, let me welcome again Dr. Hasan Azad to our department for this webinar. The faculty members and the other scholars are really happy that you are with us today. Dr. Hasan Azad, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Wasim, and thank you to Brother Amir and to the department and faculty and to everyone for this very kind, generous introduction, and for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm not sure if I can do justice, full justice by any means, to such a very large topic, but and I also want to keep my initial comments somewhat concise, because I think I personally, enjoy sort of interacting with people and seeing what what is on everyone's minds, and that sort of allows for more productive and creative discussions. I think I just want to touch on a few sort of things that strike me as important, if I may. So starting, in fact, with the word authenticity or authentic, for the adjective, of course, from which authenticity derives. Looking at the online etymology dictionary for the word authenticity, which then takes us to authentic. I'm not going to read the whole 2 paragraphs, but some of the salient points. It's a mid-14th century word meaning authoritative, duly authorized, right? And in brackets, it says a sense now obsolete, which is interesting to note, because I'm not sure to what extent that is actually the case. Nevertheless, from Old French, meaning authentic, canonical, directly from medieval Latin, authenticus, from Greek authentikos, meaning original, genuine principle, principle, P-A-L, principle. Another interesting meaning that derives from it, one acting on one's own authority, right, which I think is very relevant for our discussion today, from autos, or self, right? Yeah, and maybe one more line. Traditionally, modern use, authentic implies that the contents of the thing in question correspond to the fact and are not fictitious. Hence, they are trustworthy, reliable. Anyway, so that's enough of the dictionary for now. Well, I don't think we refer back to the dictionary, but so what that, to my mind, what it raises, the question it raises is, in the context of this discussion, of course, is what is, as it were, truly Islamic, right? What can be rightfully considered as sort of being true to the Islamic tradition, shall we say? And what is something that's extraneous, or it's a later innovation? Of course, in Islamic discourse, the notion of innovation has historically, there have been sort of, it's been problematized significantly, not least because of the famous hadith that everyone knows. Nevertheless, the question of authenticity, I think, the entire title, by the way, I really appreciate the title of today's discussion, which Amir sent me. I really appreciate the title. One could take pretty much, if not all the words of the title, but significant individual words of the title, and just focus on those individual words and have a lot to say. And I'm not going to do that necessarily today, but it's worth thinking about titles, and language is a fascinating thing, of course. As someone, my original background is in English, so I inevitably think about language, how language is deployed, how we employ language to sort of serve certain functions consciously and otherwise, and how we are then at the same time limited by the very limitations of language. And how does this relate to what we're discussing today? I'm reminded, perhaps one may say inevitably, when it comes to the question of authenticity, when it comes to the question of being, as it were, true to this very rich tradition, historic, living intellectual tradition that is the Islamic tradition, I'm perhaps inevitably reminded of Ibn Arabi. You know, many consider him to be the greatest sheikh in the Islamic context, of course, and his notion that on the Day of Judgment, people will be brought before God, of course, and God, in his, her, it's, you know, ultimately God is beyond gender, but, you know, again, this is the both the limitations of language and the sort of facilitations of language, right? But God will appear to an individual, let's say, and in the form that that individual recognizes, right? And that individual will then acknowledge the reality of God and say, God, you are real. I acknowledge you and I bear testimony, right? But then God, in his infinite wisdom and some may even say sense of humor, God has a sense of humor based on the hadith, and one can't help but feel that God has a sense of humor. God then will take another form that the person has no knowledge of, and that same person will then deny God, right? And then, if I'm not mistaken, I may be combining two traditions here, Akbarian traditions. If I'm doing that, forgive me. But in any case, this is how I'm recalling it, and I should have refreshed my memory before speaking today. But then God will make it known to that person, it's the same God who you just denied, and the person will be presented with the option of, do you want to enter into paradise based on your good works, or would you like to enter based on my mercy? And God, and the individual will say, verily God, based on your mercy, right? I may have combined two stories there, but nevertheless, the point of this story, I think, is a very, very profound one, which Ibn Arabi speaks very profoundly about, Sheikh Al-Akbar, which is that human beings in our unique constitutions, that each and every one of us is uniquely constituted, right? This is according to Akbarian metaphysics, that we all individually have an utterly unique and therefore sort of never replicated again, either before or after, sort of constellation of the divine names, right? And so based on that unique constellation, we understand God accordingly to that understanding. And this, Ian Almond famously has written very powerfully, comparing Ibn Arabi's metaphysics and sort of understanding of this unique constitution of each individual to Derrida, interestingly enough. And the point that I want to make in saying all of this and sort of starting by mentioning this story and laying this background as well, is to point to the fact, one could maybe speak, you know, I think it's fact, but it could be disputed, I'm sure. As far as I'm concerned, that ultimately, Islam, which we understand as being this very extremely rich intellectual, religious, spiritual tradition, ultimately there isn't only one Islam, right? And this is I'm kind of maybe going to contradict myself very shortly after having said this. And I remember the great scholar of Sufism, one of the greatest scholars of Sufism living today and serving all of humanity today, from whom I certainly have benefited tremendously from over the years, William Chittick. I remember him mentioning one time, I remember, you know, he was maybe attending some sort of dars or lesson. In any case, he mentioned that the only thing that we can say with certainty about the Islamic tradition that everyone agrees upon universally is the Shahadatain, the La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, right? And then everything else is up for debate. And I think that's a very empowering idea. It's a very sort of scary idea as well, because that means we really, you know, we have to do the work, right? Those of us who are engaged, who have the blessing and the challenge of being engaged a little bit in this kind of work, that we have to really figure this stuff out, as it were, in every generation. Of course, there's a famous hadith that speaks to this. Now that being said, now I'm going to sort of, all of that being said, I'm going to somewhat contradict myself a little bit, and I don't want to go on and on in a sort of one-sided fashion, but as far as the initial groundwork, all of this being said, we are also faced with some very real facts on the ground, right? One of those facts being the reality of modernity, the reality of Western modernity, right? Which of course has been exported to the rest of the world, and in many ways actually has been imposed on the rest of the world through colonialism and its very real institutions. And what that has meant is that, and this is something I look a little bit at in my doctoral work, or did look at in my doctoral work, which is to say that Islam, as we interpret it today, very often, if not always, I mean, I kind of make this somewhat radical claim that Islam is always necessarily, to a lesser or greater extent, thought through Western paradigms of thought. By virtue of the fact that we live in a world where Western educational institutions are omnipresent, we think through languages that are not historically native to the Islamic tradition, shall we say. The English language today, as the great scholar of Islam, Said Hossein Nasr has mentioned, I think it's very convincing that he says this, and I tend to agree, that he said that English has become a language of Islam. So that's also true, right? Nevertheless, these sort of structures, these institutional structures, these philosophical structures and so forth, entail a certain way of thinking about things, which it could be, I would contend, it could be seriously argued that those structures through which we think about Islam limit Islam in a certain way that perhaps historically has been unprecedented, right? Specifically thinking about and relating to one of the comments that Amir kindly made, which is the question of, what is the question? What Amir sort of hinted at, the idea of the individual, right? The modern Western subject, who is this thinking, autonomous, right? Going back famously, right, to Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? So the modern subject, the modern originally Western subject, but now the modern global subject, increasingly so, has this sense that he or she can think through things for him or herself and come to a valid conclusion about things, right? This is the conceit. This is the sort of unique arrogance, I would say, of the modern subject, that he or she believes that whatever he or she thinks, just by virtue of the fact that he or she has thought it, has some value. And then again, I'm going to wrap up in 2 minutes. That and we see this playing out endlessly in the context of social media, and then of course this is a problem that is not going away anytime soon. If anything, it's intensifying every month, if not every week, if not every day. And this is a far cry. This sort of modern, the conceit of the modern subject, again, which I contend is inseparable, or the Muslim subject or modern Muslimness is inseparable from the modern Western subject's thinking, right? This unique arrogance of the modern Muslim subject, or the modern subject as such, is a far cry from the traditional understanding, the traditional scholarly understanding in the Islamic context, but universally actually, but it's sticking with the Islamic context, of Allahu Alam, right? God knows best. Scholars were, I mean, the real scholars through the ages and even today, they always said, they basically lived and died by this premise that God knows best. Whatever I say, by necessity of the fact that, given the fact that I'm a created being, and that I am therefore fallible, whatever I say is always going to have limitations. And that, ultimately God knows the truth of it all. So there's some very preliminary thoughts on this, as Dr. Wasim has rightly pointed out, a very vast and I believe also an important subject. I'd love to sort of open it up for questions, remarks, so that we can continue to engage. Hello?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a good introduction of the topic. I hope it has generated many questions. So we are going to take questions and carry on this discussion forward.
Yes, so I think someone's raised their hand. It's Najim. So if you'd like to unmute yourself, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Najim Saqib, please go ahead.
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Azad.
Yes, hello.
Basically, my question is regarding what Dr. Sayyid Hussain Nasr had said, English as a language of Islam.
Yes.
So what I think is that this English speaking, the scholarship of Islam, current contemporary English speaking scholarship of Islam, undermine the role of the contemporary non-English speaking scholarship of Islam, because we know that currently the non-English speaking scholarship, they do not have that much audience.
Sure.
English being a global language, they do not have that much of audience. Are they kind of undermined by the English speaking academia? Because what this statement refers, that English has become the language of Islam, I think that there's a case of like big misrepresentation of those people, of those academia who are not truly global. By global, I mean that who do not have global audience, who need translation of their works to go global. So I'd like if you would please elaborate on this issue.
No, I appreciate that question.
Thank
No,
you.
I think that's a very fair point, actually, and your point really ties in with my sense about all of this, which is to sort of say that historically, again, right, in order to think through our sort of our modern conditions and realities as Muslim and otherwise, right, that we can't not think about the reality of colonialism. And the reason why English has become the global lingua franca is because basically the British, right? I'm telling you what you already know, of course, but I think it bears repeating, which is that the British ruled, and the sun never set, right, in the British Empire, which is a phenomenal reality. They owned so much, and they conquered and colonized so much of the world, and they imposed their sort of structures on the rest of the world. And and in imposing their structures of thought and otherwise, right, economics and what have you, political systems, they of course they had to actively undermine the what's it called, the indigenous forms of thought and practice and so forth. And that's continued to through today, to pretend that colonialism happened in sometime in the past and no longer, it's just morphed into other forms. That's why people refer oftentimes to neo-colonialism, right? And and it very often not only, but very often takes the form of soft power, right, through these sort of cultural institutions that come from the West. One of the major cultural institutions, of course, being Hollywood, right? And it's interesting for me to think, as someone who thinks a lot about culture itself, again, most probably because of my background in English, but it's interesting to note how the influence of Hollywood is so pervasive that one sees how films are made in the rest of the world today outside of Hollywood, very much taking cue very often, not only, but very often taking cue from Hollywood as an industry. And as an example, very quickly, I'll mention the Oscar-winning film of last year, I believe it was. Yes, it was this South Korean film called Parasite. It was a Korean language film. But it was interesting to note the aesthetics of the film is it has a very crisp, one can't help but feel sort of Hollywood not mainstream Hollywood. I mean, it's sort of more, it's a very intelligent film. But anyway, so how does this relate? As far as Najim's question regarding scholarship coming out of Western academies, taking on almost this hegemonic nature, right? By virtue of the name, shall we say, I mean, the name of the person himself, perhaps. I mean, let's say Said Hussein Nasr, of course, he's world famous, of course. But also, even before they become famous, let's say the universities they've studied at. So, and just because they have this name attached to them, does that necessarily mean that they are representative of the rest of the world? And one would have to agree, of course, with Najim, that no, how can that possibly be, right? And I think this is a very real problem that we have to tackle on this very question. So I appreciate that. I don't have a simple answer, but I mean, other than to say I absolutely agree, yes. I think the next
could I ask a related question slightly?
I think that there are two other people who had raised their hands before, though. Maybe we can work through people.
I know. How can I raise hand?
Yes.
So can I ask a question?
Yes, I think, yes. 866-888. You had asked to raise your hand, I saw. Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes. So my question is rather, I would say that you talked of the lingua franca, the way the language of.
If I could see your face, I would really appreciate it, by the way. It would help me just, because otherwise I'm looking at numbers. Yes, I appreciate it.
Okay. So my question, it's not a question. It's like maybe you can say comment or whatever you want to say, an observation. So
Yes.
The thing is that we say that the primary language, since the topic of the discussion started, was that authenticity of interpreting Islam or whatever you may call it. So if we say that the primary language is language of or the primary repository or reservoir of Islamic knowledge from last 1400 or 1500 years is like the three languages is like if I say it's in sequence, it's Arabic, then Persian, and then maybe Urdu. Maybe English maybe is also one of the last 100 or 150 years. Now there are two schools, there are two camps. Maybe people, because that in English is an all-pervading language, and naturally Islam or any other religion will have the things. So it comes directly. There are two schools. People who I'll connect it with people like if people who want to like mystics who want to say that God can know the babblings of a human heart. We need not to communicate with God in languages secondary. But then there is another school of thought. Maybe if you want to, God chose Arabic as a language to communicate. So from these two schools of thoughts, maybe how do you, I would not say, how would you address these two interpretations of interpreting Islam in the native language, in the languages of last 1400 years, and this new elite or new understanding of Islam, or new interpretations of Islam, which may not be necessarily from Muslim lands, maybe traditional schools like Deoband, maybe Al-Azhar, and there are two, they have a different, in Medina, they have their own way of interpreting Islam or hermeneutics. While in case of Western universities, people like Hussein Nasr, so there seems to be a gulf. How do you see you can bridge it?
Thank you. So I would first of all disagree with your initial premise that the primary languages, I mean, they have historically been the primary languages. I mean, Urdu, comes much later, of course. Arabic and Persian, certainly, but not only Urdu. I mean, as someone who is ethnically Bangladeshi, I would say Bengali. I mean, I would take.
Maybe in successive order.
So the point being, I think to Said Hussein Nasr's point, right, and to also to your point, that, I mean, human beings, we tend to think and communicate through language. I say we tend to because there are always exceptions to the rule. There are also communications which transcend language, and we know this Sufi literature is replete with this understanding. I just recently interviewed Professor Phil Dorrell just in the last couple of weeks about his recent book that just came out on Islamic theology in the Turkish Republic. And of course, that theology comes through Turkish. So I think this is one of the great, geniuses of the Islamic tradition, historically at least, that it has been able to make itself, or Islam has the sort of inner facilities to be able to be relevant to people no matter where they. And this is the conceit of that people who think through the Islamic tradition. I think this has largely been true. So to say that there's only one language or two languages, I don't think that's fair. I mean, I agree with Sheikh Hussein in his statement. I think the problematization of English, I think the hegemonic nature of English is something that we should point to and problematize. And this is a problem with hegemonies anywhere. I mean, any sort of formally, let's say an oppressed people today could potentially become the abusers down the line, and the abusers today can become the oppressed tomorrow. So hegemony is something that we should always be conscious of, and speaking to the department like yours that deals with politics, I know that this is something you're very aware of. So I'm very allergic to notions of hegemony, but this is something we have to think through. And related to all of this, and we haven't really touched upon this yet, if we do, I don't know, but the question of digitality, right? That digitality throws a whole new sort of dimension to this mix. Digitality, right, which comes through Silicon Valley originally, right, which is an English-speaking context, so which has its own logics, right, which then get, those logics are sort of consciously and unconsciously expressed through the technologies themselves. And those logics then go into constraining how we, as these modern / postmodern religious subjects who are engaging with one another, right, through these digital technologies, we are then sort of off the bat limited in certain ways. I mean, certain things are facilitated for sure. The fact that I can speak with you live while you're in Kashmir and I'm in Kent, UK, it's phenomenal. It's crazy. But at the same time, I'm also interested in asking questions about what are the limitations placed. But I think Aqib had his hand up next, and then to Mr. Noor after that. I think before Noor, Amir, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let Professor Baba ask his question. Professor Noor.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Hello, Professor. Yes.
Yes. In fact, it would be in continuation with what you were previously asked about.
Yes, Professor. Yes.
My question is, because I have been lately following the writings in the West, in Islamic Studies Department, some of the Islamic Studies departments in America and other parts of Europe. My first initial point would be Islam claims to be a universal religion. So languages don't matter. What we look at is the quality of work that's being done.
Sure.
And from that perspective, I have been following recently is methodologically, because our question is methodologically and show related also. This is my inquisitiveness. I just want to reconfirm my own feelings. Is that there is a lot of good work being done, other than the traditional great scholars we know, Sayyid Hussain, Nasser, etc. But in Islamic Studies departments all across America and some of the European universities, very important and reasonably quite authentic work is being done by Muslims sometimes, or even by non-Muslims, which are path-breaking. I think we need to, in terms of that quality-wise, that's my feeling, that the kind of work that is being done in Western universities is remarkable. As not all times of that we had colonial hangover, most of the scholars had, that I think qualitatively different. It's not Orientalism traditionally we knew about. The way their approach was is very authentic, a very sincere effort being made to understand Islam in its different dimensions, in an honest and sincere manner. Honest, of course, it's all relative words, but it's in a sincere effort is being done. Academically, I would say authentic effort is being done. I would like to have your response, because that's I'm looking at from distance, from periphery. So I would like to know what is your opinion about it.
No, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate your comments. I think I would tend to resonate with that, certainly. I mean, one could say I'm biased because that's kind of my, that's kind of come through that. But, I feel also that there's some very interesting, very often important work that's being done in Western contexts.
Mostly Islamic studies departments, yes.
Pardon?
Mostly Islamic studies departments do it.
Right. I think, and one could speak also to perhaps the contexts of these departments, right, and the context from which many of these scholars are coming up, right? Not only, but very often they themselves are Westerners, and let's say if they're Muslim, but because there are many incredible non-Muslim contributors to a lot of these discussions. In the case of some of these Western Western Muslim scholars, they're sort of, shall we say, one could say, very conscious of their context. They're very complex, sort of intellectual and multi-religious contexts within which they're writing and thinking, and have to be cognizant of. Right, what one can never really get away from the very real sort of politics of knowledge production, and the sort of paradigms through which one has to think, right? So again, which isn't to say it's universally true, because there's also some scholarship, but I think less and less so. As you rightly point out, Professor, the sort of the Orientalist type scholarship has. I think one or two people are still producing it, but by and large, it's really speaking to real questions and concerns. So that's also true. But I think to the Najm's earlier point, I think that also, this is the challenge, like holding two apparently opposing views at the same time, or maybe more than two, like views that are in tension. At the same time, there is this question of to what extent is this incredible work that's being produced necessarily relevant to people, let's say, I don't know, in Bangladesh, where my parents are originally from, right? But then again, through digitality, these questions are becoming more and more relevant to people all the way, let's say, over in Bangladesh, what have you. So this is a very complex and bizarre. We're living through bizarre times and fascinating times. So, but I really appreciate that. I think the person who has had his hand up for a while now is Akib. Would you like to? Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Azad.
And if we could see that, I'd really appreciate it. Just it helps me, yes. If you don't mind, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Akib Javed here.
Yes, hi.
Yeah. Dr. Azad, actually, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your talk about the plurality of Islams, the very word Islams with plural S. So I wanted to just, know that how do you use this? Because you also use it in your Tahsil comments, the Islams. So the idea behind Islam is that we don't have any monolithic interpretation of Islam. There are certain, polysemic tradition of Islam is there, where we have different interpretations of Islam, heterogeneity. So, but the idea and the danger behind is that, when we claim there are many Islams, what exactly we have when we say there is an Islamic tradition? Is there something immutable? Is there something changeless within the Islamic axis? So the danger is that after post 9/11, it was impetus on Islamic scholars to show different performance of Islam. So the plurality comes in. We need to tolerate different performance in Islam. So when you use this word Islams, do you use it as in the performance of Islam, or do you use it in a sense when we come to the word of hermeneutics of Islam? So how do you use it? Can you clarify?
That's a great question. Probably in both senses. I mean, we're always performing, right? To be a human subject, to be a socialized human subject, not least as someone who's speaking before an audience today and has, some small presence online. There's no getting away from the performative aspect of things. But I would also add that it's not only performance, right? Because and to Professor Sub's earlier point that this is what I've come to appreciate through my sort of studies of the Islamic tradition, not least, I mean, the historic Islamic tradition, broadly speaking, but also through the scholarship that's being produced now, because there is a multiplicity of interpretations of what it means to be Islamic, right? We know this to be the case historically. There's certain immutable principles without question, and this is why I mentioned William Chittick's point, that the one thing, when we study the Islamic tradition historically, the only one thing that all the scholars are in agreement on is the Shahadatayn, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Everything else, there's some room for maneuver. Yes, the prayers, the 5 daily prayers. But then the Shia, they pray the 5, but then they combine 2 and 2, right? So it becomes 3 times a day. One thing we see in the context of the Sharia, right, historically speaking, that the ulama, they knew, again, the idea of Allahu Alam, but and we know this, of course, but it bears repeating, that their fatwas were non-binding sort of legal pronouncements, right? Non-binding because, they didn't always, of course, have the sanction of the state and weren't imposed that way. Interestingly enough, that really significantly came about through colonial incursions, right? But historically, Muslims, they knew that, and we even see this in the Prophet's time, right? That certain people, if they wanted more lenient fatwas, and after the Prophet's life, they would go to some of the companions, right? If they wanted more harsh opinions, they knew who to go to, right? So Islam has had this ability to accommodate people, because human beings, let's remind ourselves again, this is really why I mentioned the Sheikh Al-Akbar's notion of, and he calls it what does he call it? The God of, oh goodness, I forget the phraseology, but it's basically the notion that each and every one of us, we have a unique understanding of God. And it's almost like that is my God. My God is unique to me, which isn't to say there are a multiplicity of gods, but God is ultimately, God can never be exhausted, right, by definition. God's reality, and anything that I perceive to be real of God is necessarily going to be a limited understanding of things. And given my unique constitution, that it's going to be my own understanding, right? So if Islam is in very broad-based principles, right, the sort of immutable aspect, which is La ilaha illallah, right, there's no God with a lowercase g, but God with a capital G, then if I were to describe my understanding of God, which theologians through the centuries, this is true in all the traditions, right? They have attempted to speak of God. And sometimes they've come up with very different formulations, right? And this is the beauty of tradition. And tradition is a living thing, right? It occurs amongst communities, interpretive communities. It's not something, no one can pick up a book and show anyone, say, this is Islam, whatever this. The Quran is a living text. The Quran, I mean, is first and foremost something that we internalize as Muslims, right? Through the repetition of its recitation and through the prayers and so forth. The reality of the Quran sort of, it penetrates our being. Right, and then we live out to the best of our ability that, but it's going to differ from person to person, and if Islam is submission to God, well, that submission is going to look different from person to person because we're all unique. My expression of Islam is going to be necessarily limited compared to other people's, and so forth. So I hope that goes a little way towards addressing it.
Before taking another question, I think Israt Bashir wants to ask question, but before that, you mentioned of Ibn Arabi, like that he says everyone has unique understanding of God. William Chittick, you mentioned him many a times in our talk. He has a similar point. I would like to quote him. Yeah, quote unquote, no two persons' understanding will ever be exactly the same. My belief in God will never be identical to your belief in God. My understanding of God cannot be the same as your understanding of God. So he further goes on to say that there is one God, but an infinity of creatures, and an infinity of beliefs about the one God. Even for a single person, there will never be one understanding and one belief. So that's what Ibn Arabi also emphasizes.
Thank you for that. That's beautiful. Yeah, that really captures it.
Ishrad Bashir.
Yes.
Hello everyone. I don't know if I have to say good morning or good good afternoon. I joined the lecture a little late. There was some problem with my mic. I couldn't hear much of it. Professor Azad, I wish to ask if you are aware of about the work of Fatima Marnisi, Moroccan scholar who has written about what now has been coined as what you call Islamic feminism. Since this lecture was about authenticity of the contemporary interpretations, I think Fatima Marnisi is also reinterpreting certain traditions regarding women's concerns. Well, as I believe that God could be personal, but jurisprudence is real. There are cultural implications of Islam that are real, and people have to deal with that. So she mostly takes support in her arguments from Al-Tabari, and many scholars would say that that's not authentic. Would you like to comment on that? I was just wondering, how do we reconcile between plurality and authenticity in Islam?
Yes. No, thank you.
Can we even talk about plurality and authenticity in Islam? Because authenticity is something that's very central to Islamic traditions. So far as it has come down to us.
Right. No, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So I'm certainly not. I'm not an authority when it comes to Islamic feminism, and I know of Fatima Marnisi's work. I don't really know her work as such. I mean, I know some of the sort of challenges to some of her pronouncements that are made. Another Islamic feminist that comes to mind, actually, speaking of Islamic feminism, right, is the famous Amina Wadud, right? And she, again, if I'm not mistaken, the Marnisi and Wadud, I mean, they're sort of maybe somewhat different in the sort of understandings of things. Then, Wadud has made pronouncements which many Muslims would take issue with and have taken issue with. I remember hearing that she and she's someone who self-identifies as Muslim, considers herself devout and is devout. So who might say otherwise? At the same time, she said that based on her studies of the Quran, she as much as it pained her and pains her, she cannot but this is what she's saying. She cannot but conclude that God is patriarchal. So which is very interesting, and I again, this is not my area at all, so I can't make any pronouncement either way, definitively. What I can say is that on the question of authenticity, and one of the reasons why I don't know if you were able to join us then, sister. When I started, I started with the by reading out some of the etymology of the word authentic, of course, which is the adjective from which authenticity, the noun, comes, and the notion of authoritative, duly authorized, right, original, genuine, principal, PRINCIPAL, implies that contents of thing in question corresponds to the facts and are not fictitious, hence trustworthy, reliable. So one of the reasons I read that, and maybe I didn't sort of, I didn't do a good enough job sort of clarifying some of where I was going with that. Orthodoxy, right? If we speak of orthodoxy, in this case, of course, Islamic orthodoxy, it's interesting to see, because if we think of authenticity, right, what is authentically Islamic, what comes to mind, what inevitably comes to mind is the question of orthodoxy, right? Correct belief, right? And one could say in the Islamic context, of course, that's because you also rightly pointed out the aspect of the Shari aspect of things, right? So orthopraxy comes into that, right? So it's correct belief and practice, right? And in some ways, maybe there's a slight more emphasis on practice than belief per se. Not to say that belief is not important in some context. Now, orthodoxy, and Dalal Asad has famously and importantly written about this, comes about through a process where power is inseparable from the creation of orthodoxy, right? And we can see this through history, which isn't to say that everything everything that exists because it's necessarily permeated is permeated by power, therefore it's necessarily suspect. I mean, I guess one shouldn't go to that extreme either, but I think it's worth noting the fact that very often power has been inseparable from the creation of some of these discourses. So if there are marginal voices, so it's an Islamic feminist discourse would be largely speaking still on the peripheries in many contexts. At the same time, I mentioned earlier my discussion with Phil Dorrell, whose very extensive study of Turkish theology, Islamic theology in the Turkish Republic. I haven't read the book itself, but having read the introduction to the work and in quite a lengthy discussion with him, it's a remarkable work. Islamic feminism is very alive and well, for example, in the Turkish context, and it's very, shall we say, authentic. You know, it's in keeping, and in many cases, it's deriving from, it's sort of in conversation with Western feminism, right? I mean, the origin of feminism. So, I'm hesitant to say something isn't authentic or something is authentic, because that's not my place. It's really not my place.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think Professor Shaukat had his hand up.
Hello.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Azad.
Hello, Professor. Yes.
So, keeping in mind the title of today's lecture, that the authenticity of challenges that are before the contemporary interpretations of Islam, can we say that towards the last half, or we can say the last quarter of the 20th century and the ongoing first quarter of 21st century, we have been seeing a kind of shift that in order to appease the contemporary issues that have raised because of the progress and the contemporary capitalist stance that we are undergoing through, that the Islamic scholars in general, they are coming so low that they want to, by hook or crook, they want to give some answers to the contemporary challenges that are actually, in a way, if I can use the term, that are actually superficial than the sublime and basic concepts that actually the religion, or particularly Islam, comes to answer. That it tries to guide us towards the basic challenges that humanity at large is actually is facing or shall face in any time. And that the greater threat to authenticity is that we sometimes stoop so low that we actually neglect the basic wisdom of Islam, that what it is all about. Because, for example, we are living in the age of quote unquote, that we think that this is the true sense of Islamic scholarship. Because earlier, when we go to the classical period of Islam, or we can say golden age of Islam, there was not that much knowledge. Information was not that much, but the Islamic civilization that was created, it had in a way been able to give that kind of society in place that that had all the things intact, where these kind of challenges were not seen. Yes.
Thank you. So, yeah, I do take your point, and this is something I've written about a tiny bit, and I've thought a little bit about that. To what extent are we, those of us who self-identify as Muslim, but not only those of us who are religious in this contemporary world, how are we consciously or unconsciously, to use Aqib's earlier word, to what extent are we performing right and stooping, in some cases, sort of selling out, as it were, to appease certain forces? And that's something that is worth thinking about, certainly. At the same time, some of these existential questions are very real, these existential challenges, right? The assault on the Islamic tradition, on Islam and Muslims, has been unrelenting for quite some time now. And it does not show any sign of letting up, any signs of letting up. If anything, it's intensifying. It's going to continue to intensify, as far as I can tell, and which actually scares me. I'm fearful for our collective future, Muslims and otherwise. I think for religious people, religion is something that is very much antithetical to a fundamentally secular worldview. I mean, secularism, of course, posits the separation between church and state, famously. But I think ultimately, and this seems to me, and maybe this is a bit of a polemical point, but I can't help but feel that ultimately secularism does not like religious expression of any type, ultimately. And I think religious people of all stripes are under threat by a militant form of atheism, which very often goes with secularist intentionalities. At the same time, I must also say that some of these questions are not insignificant. It's, as far as the question of to what extent can an earlier question regarding Islamic feminism, right? To what extent women can have a say in public discourse? To what extent women can and should have a voice? To all these, these are not insignificant questions if someone is a woman, right? I mean, as a man, I could say, well, it doesn't bother me, right? But if we're fair, then these are very, very important questions, right? And I would contend, and there have been very authentically, right? Very traditionally trained Muslim scholars that I know of at least. There's one example that immediately comes to mind. Well, his name escapes me at this moment. I remember someone had mentioned him, and she's she's actually a professor now, but she came through a somewhat traditional education. And I remember she mentioned this particular sheikh, male sheikh, and how he self-identifies as feminist, while being traditionally trained Muslim scholar. And some have argued, and one could say, well, this is just, Muslims kind of selling out and trying to appease. I don't know. There are some facts of Islamic history. The Prophet, the Blessed Prophet, he empowered women. There's no question about it, right? Women had a voice. Women challenged him. They raised questions to his face. This is the messenger of God. right? So we can't deny that. And I believe fundamentally, I mean, not to go on about this point, but I think it's a very important point. And it's something I really believe in 100%, that that in order for humanity, not only Muslims, in order for humanity to get out of the morass that we're in today, we're in a complete mess as a species. I mean, this isn't news to any of us here today. We're in a complete mess to the point of God knows how we're going to get out of this if we ever do. You know, we're on the path to our own destruction. The only way we stand a chance, as far as I can tell, and this is what I've learned from some people I very much look up to and have learned from, is if we re-empower the female feminine voice in the world today, because there's a hyper-masculinization of society today. One of the reasons why we're destroying everything is because we're hyper-masculine. And Islam traditionally understood, speaking of authentic, to use that word, in my experience, is a very feminine religion. It's very attuned. The Prophet was criticized by his detractors for being effeminate because he was loving and caring to his children. He took care of himself. He was very gentle. He was a mercy to all the people, right? So we need to rediscover the feminine in Islam, to use the title of one of Anu Shimel's books.
I would like to.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
I would like to slightly add on what you have been saying.
Yes.
I have had some inkling of what Muslim feminism is all about. I don't call it necessarily always Islamic, but Muslim, of course, it is. And there are a number of them. Amina Wadud is there, Fatima Mersini is there. There are many more. And there are male also, some of the male figures also, I think, in Egypt, in recent times. I think it will be trivializing to tell them non-authentic and stooping too low. They are fundamentally differentiating themselves from Western feminism and trying to orient toward themselves in an Islamic tradition. And Fatima, this Amina Wadud is basically drawing from Quran. And there are others who are drawing from Hadith and the life of the Prophet, Sunnah. So this is, I don't think we need to trivialize that they're not going outside the Islamic tradition. They are drawing from Islamic tradition. And I would very authentically say, I would at least say with my conviction that what we do in Muslim societies today is not in tune with the authentic Islam or traditional Islam, the Quranic Islam or Islam of Sunnah of the Prophet's time. So I think we cannot trivialize these things, and these need to be taken seriously. As you said rightly, there is plurality of understanding of things. You can't say that one is correct and another is wrong. I think we need to get into serious debate on these issues. So I get this Muslim feminism. Maybe you don't agree with everything that they say, but there is much of it that makes very, very, very relevant sense, and we need to take it very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Preston. I really appreciate that. Yes. God bless you. Yes, I think we did.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Actually, my point was not, I was not talking about a particular thought.
Yes.
Actually, my point was that the way the scholars are going, it is a kind of, I even wrote in the chat box that they try to approach it synchronically. When there is Islamic tradition behind it, for example, we were talking about feminism, Muslim feminism, or so we can say Islamic feminism, because Islam has it has answer for everything. Not almost, it has answer for it. Otherwise, it can't stand as a guiding principle up to doomsday. But my point was that the contemporary issues where sometimes silence is also an answer. Why scholars indulge giving answers based on the contemporary premises, where they are not taking actually it in a holistic way how the base of these answers, these questions is when we don't take care of the basic sublime questions of life. that Islam is actuality. My point was that.
No, I
Thank you,
appreciate
sir.
it. Thank you, sir. I think someone else had their hand up. Vivos1610.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Alaikum salam. Yes.
But actually, my question is that whatever we are talking about currently, I want to get this further explained in light of the ayah of Surah Al-Nahl, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Anzalna ilayka dhikra litubayyina lin-nasi ma nuzila ilayhi." And similar ayah we find in Surah Al-Qiyamah, "Inna alayna jam'ahu wa qur'ana, thumma inna alayna bayana." So these two ayahs bring in front of us the thing that Prophet was essentially the interpreter of Quran as well. That
Yes.
means we have a full-fledged interpretation of Quran from the Prophet himself. And when we talk about the reinterpretation or the contemporary interpretation of the Islamic tradition, or we can say Quran and Sunnah, does it mean that we are trying to rediscover the original interpretation of Prophet, or it's that there is some lacuna that Prophet left and we are trying to construct or build into that gap? One thing. And second question related is that most of the people who advocate the so-called contemporary interpretation or modern interpretation, why do they often tend to negate or undermine the role of the Sunnah in the interpretation of the Quran? And this undermining or negation of the role of Sunnah often leads to waywardness about the issue of interpretation. And finally, we don't have any hook to which we can stick, or we don't have any touchstone where we can actually get our problem of authenticity solved.
Thank you.
I think
No,
I think I made my point.
No, thank you. No, these are important questions and concerns. I think we must remember, if we come from a humanities background, and I think classically trained Muslim scholars, they came from a humanities background. We have to reinvigorate the humanities. I say this, of course, someone who comes from a humanities background, but also I think this is historically accurate because it gives us a more, shall we say, a more human, nuanced view of how we are as human beings, that we are always necessarily interpreting, right? You just mentioned, the questioner just mentioned about the Prophet, the Blessed Prophet being the lived, and his lived example as being the interpreter of the Quran. This is absolutely true, without question, we cannot deny it. At the same time, our contexts are slightly different, right? And the Prophet didn't have digital means for communication, for example, right? And so how do we then make sense of our, in many cases, very different circumstances? And this has been the job of the scholars through the ages, to try and make sense of their contemporary conditions in light of the Quran and Sunnah, right? And which is not to say that somehow the Prophet used the word lacuna, right? Which doesn't say that there was a gap in the prophets. At the same time, the Prophet, a very powerful, I mean, all the sort of traditions that go back to the Prophet are powerful. In this context, I think a very powerful tradition, which is the Prophet, when the Prophet said that wisdom was the lost riding beast of the believer, right? Wheresoever he or she finds it, he or she has more right to it. And also famously, right, another tradition, very famous tradition, seek knowledge even unto China. Right? Why would the Prophet, if it were just about studying the Quran and Sunnah, well, this is part of the Sunnah. He said, seek knowledge even unto China, right? So what, we can't discard that. And historically, Muslim thinkers and scholars and philosophers, they really took it on board to practice these traditions, seeking knowledge even unto China, to really go as far as they possibly could, stretching themselves, benefiting from other traditions and perspectives. This was the reality of the Islamic tradition. Islamic theology, for example, that we should remind ourselves, came into being while in discussion with Christian theologians, in debate through Christian theologians. Nothing human exists in a vacuum. We're always interconnected, whether we're necessarily conscious of it or not. But the reality is we're always interconnected. We're always cross-pollinating, and we're dependent on one another, and we and so forth. So, the reality is we have to make sense of our unique circumstances. And this is something that traditional scholars, very traditional fuqaha, they know this, that a pronouncement in fiqh that may be applicable for one person could actually be haram for another person. Why is that? Because the contexts are different, right? And this is from the point of view of Sharia. So anyway.
Yeah, I think we should conclude it now.
Yes.
Before concluding, one last question. Shall I ask it?
Please, yes.
Okay. So why hasn't dialogue between different religions and sects within religions been instituted?
I'm sorry. I mean, your voice is kind of not very clear. It's a little muffled.
If I could see
you, maybe it'd help me read your lips as well. It's a little muffled. I'm struggling to hear you very clearly. Yes.
Okay.
If you could put your video on, maybe that could help. Yes.
My question is, why hasn't dialogue between different religions and sects within religions been instituted?
Why hasn't I still didn't get that. I apologize.
Different religions instituted. Why isn't there dialogue between different religions?
Why isn't there?
Yeah.
Oh, you don't. I feel that there is. No, you feel that there isn't. You feel there isn't enough dialogue between the different traditions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, this is. I agree. Now,
not only dialogue between religions, but between sects within religions.
Oh, within sects. Okay. No, these are very important. Well, I think this is a very human problem, right? The bias that we have towards our own group, right? I mean, I believe there's a Quranic verse where God says, each group is, and I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me, I can't remember the Arabic, but each group is satisfied with its own self, right? So it's a very human problem that we tend to kind of be very self-satisfied. And I think there's sort of evolutionary reasons why that, from an evolutionary psychological point of view, that we, because evolutionarily speaking, our survival really depended primarily on the coherence of the tribe that we were in, right? And so to maintain the coherence of that tribe, we very often, not always, but very often other tribes were enemies, for our own tribes. So we kind of are almost hardwired, right, from an evolutionary psychological point of view, to see the other in this sort of in terms of the enemy, right, and the other. Now, however, we don't stop there, because the religious spiritual impulse, the Quranic impulse, is about transcending that, right? God says, from what Muslim point of view in the Quran also, that he created human beings of different tribes and colors and tongues so that we may come to know one another, right? And I remember hearing many years ago the translator of the Quran, not only of the Quran, he sort of translated portions of the Quran and I believe the Tao Te Ching or some other Eastern text, Thomas Cleary, he mentioned about this verse that it was the perfect antidote to racism, right? That we may come to know one another. So I think it's one of the most miraculous, genuinely, I use that word with no sense of exaggeration. I think it's a miraculous thing when we come to know other people, because we come to appreciate the beauty of God's creation in other people, like the diversity. I mean, the phrase that's sometimes used, the unity in diversity, right? That God's unity, the uniqueness of God, we can find in the miraculousness of the diversity of human beings and the diversity of perspectives and the diversity of customs and cultures and so on and so on. And I think it behooves us as people of faith and otherwise, just as human beings, that we genuinely make inroads, we make efforts to try to understand people who maybe think slightly differently from us, maybe who look slightly differently, whether it's within other sects, whether it's, you know, sects within the Islamic tradition or outside the Islamic tradition. I think it's a real tragedy that Muslims today no longer, we don't seriously, by and large, we don't seriously study other traditions. I say it's a tragedy today because historically Muslims made huge efforts. The classical scholars, someone mentioned the golden age of Islam before. In the golden age of Islam, scholars went out of their way to study other traditions for the pure reason of you know, there's something to be benefited from that. So I think this is, and if we also, in addition to empowering the feminine dimension of the human being, right? This is one half of humanity. Let's not forget the feminine. So we cannot but empower the feminine, because it's, if as men, if we don't, we are killing half of ourselves. So in addition to that, I believe fundamentally another aspect of it's an existential question as far as our survival is concerned, is we have to have serious not just interfaith discussions like on a more sort of superficial level, let's try and understand, but on a deeper level, let's try and address some of the major ethical questions of today from the perspectives of the multiple traditions, because the different traditions have incredible amounts of wisdom to offer humanity as such. And we stand to benefit when we create spaces where we discuss with one another and learn from one another and try to address these very, very real, very thorny, very, very difficult existential questions that we're facing today.
Thank you so much. It was really a thought-provoking session.
Oh, thank you.
Hopefully we can continue such sessions in future also. So before concluding, I would like to request Professor Khalid for concluding remarks and of course vote of thanks. But I forgot it earlier to mention that Professor Khalid Wasim is the coordinator of the Department of Politics and Governance, and he has been kind enough to allow us to go ahead with these meetings. Rather, he has been very generous and kind enough to allow us to arrange such sessions. So we are really thankful to him, Professor Khalid.
Thank you, Professor. Yes. Oh, is Professor Khalid, is he gone? I think we've lost Professor Khalid.
So let me thank you formally. Thank you so much.
No, there is Professor Khalid there. I apologize. No, sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asad, for such a wonderful discussion and delivering this webinar. And it has raised a lot of questions, and our research scholars have benefited a lot. And we all are also thankful to Professor Noor Ahmad Baba, our senior professor, who has been always a guiding force in the department. He also takes an interest in all our activities, and today also his questions, his intervention was really good. I also want to thank Amir and all the PhD scholars who are taking the lead in making this group functional, research scholars reading group. I hope that in coming times we'll have more discussions, and when we are all right, and when the pandemic leaves us, we would like that Dr. Asad Dr. Hasan Azad also visits Kashmir and visits our department. We would like to have you in the department physically and interact with our students, not only research scholars, but also the master's students who are also writing their dissertations on various issues. Thanks a lot, Dr. Asad. Dr. Azad.
No, God bless you, Dr. Asim. I really appreciate the very, very generous comments, and I really appreciate all the questions and your, your very, your active participation. That really means a lot. God bless you all in everything that you do, and may God, empower you with the greatest of gifts to do all the necessary work that you have to do. Because there's a lot of work to be done by all of us. So we're all aware of that. So I pray for you all. And again, I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And I request prayers from you all. God bless you all. Thank you.